Tonight we're going to continue with our kind of examination of some signs of the Lord's return. And of course, everything that we're talking about is from the Bible. So we're not talking about some strange dream someone had or some kind of obscure interpretation. I was just reminded, I looked it up in 1997, before most of you were born. There was a book called The Bible Code. The Bible Code. I would not recommend anybody go out and buy it. It was really hot for a while, and it purports to take the Hebrew text of the Bible, and if you take certain letters from certain words and put them in some kind of a column or something like that, then you get these really startling prophecies, which they say some of them had been fulfilled. By the time I actually looked at it, it had been out for a couple of years, and by then it was on the bargain rack in the bookstore, which means it was not a bestseller anymore. And I just looked at it a little bit, and in there were prophecies that had already been fulfilled, and there were prophecies that were going to be fulfilled, and even they had dates. So I just looked at a couple of those, and like there was going to be this, gigantic earthquake in California that was going to destroy California on a specific date that had already passed. So it wasn't accurate. But people are really interested in things like prophecy for good reason. People want to know what's going to happen. I know a physics professor, I think he's probably retired now, but he was at UC Berkeley. And I think of all the people I've met in the world, you meet a lot of people, and some of them you can just tell, this guy is really smart. I mean, this guy, he can do things in his head that I couldn't do with a computer or calculator or anything like that. He was a quantum physicist. And one time I went in to talk to him, and he was a believer, but he was explaining his work to me, and he really dumbed it down. Now I have a PhD in not in physics, but in science, and I could kind of understand what he was talking about, but not totally. But he had been an unbeliever. He grew up an unbeliever, but he's, like I said, he's very bright. Not only is he smart, he's like a concert quality pianist, speaks several languages. But for some reason, he started reading the Bible, and he started reading the Old Testament, looking at the prophecies in the Old Testament, and that had been fulfilled. Most of them in the New Testament, but some were fulfilled in the Old Testament. He could not believe, it's like, this is such an exact prophecy, and it was made hundreds of years, maybe even a couple thousand years before its fulfillment. And that was enough to cause him to believe in the accuracy of the Bible. And the Bible is the Word of God. He became a very strong, firm believer. And I would even say, what Will said is correct. On the college campuses, most faculty are not going to give Christians any benefit of the doubt. They're not going to be much help to us. He was a big help because he would give lectures about things related to physics, but then he'd raise the screen and show the answer is God. So he's quite something. But a lot of people, they still, when they look at the prophecies in the Bible, they make arguments that it's hard to refute them. They might say, well, someone went back and wrote that after it happened. So it looks like it's being predicted, but it actually happened. And then they wrote a prophecy about it and stuck it in somewhere earlier. And, I was not there 2,000, 3,000 years ago. I can't tell them exactly what happened. But wouldn't it be great if there's a prophecy in the Bible that we could look forward to, that when it gets fulfilled, we can say, see, I told you. This is the type of thing we want to get into. And tonight, we will see one of these prophecies that has been fulfilled in modern history. And it's not an obscure, kind of funny little prophecy like, oh, big deal. But it's very accurate. And this was a big, big, big thing when it happened. But we'll get into that. So maybe I can have the first slide. Who's doing the slides?
I'll be doing the slides, sorry.
Okay.
I lost my host.
You're just too engrossed. Okay, while you're getting it up,
Here we go.
is it there? Okay. We kind of, there you go.
There we go.
Okay. So this slide is entitled "The Prophecy of the 70 Weeks in Daniel." Now, Daniel is a book in the Old Testament, and it's not that long. It's one of my favorite books in the whole Bible. It's only about 12 chapters, but there are some very, very, very important, even critical prophecies in the book of Daniel. Of course, we all know Daniel. He's, thrown in the lion's den. His friends were thrown in the fiery furnace. It's got some good stories. But regarding things that will happen even far beyond Daniel's lifetime, it's one of the most important books in the Bible. So in Daniel chapter 9, it says that Daniel had been praying and praying for weeks. And eventually, he got this answer to his prayer. At the end of chapter 9, I'll just read these verses. You can follow along. It says, 70 weeks are a portion for your people and for your holy city to close the transgression and to make an end of sins and to make propitiation for iniquity and to bring in the righteousness of the ages and to seal up vision and prophet and to anoint the Holy of Holies. This verse is clearly talking about the end of this age. This is talking about the age. And so it says 70 weeks. We'll get into what that means. Verse 25, know therefore and comprehend is very important. From the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the time of Messiah the Prince will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with street and trench, even in distressful times. And after the 62 weeks, Messiah will be cut off and will have nothing. And the people of the prince who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it will be a flood, and even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, and in the middle of the week he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, will replace the sacrifice and the oblation with abominations of the desolator, even until the complete destruction that has been determined is poured out upon the desolator. So what does all this mean? Well, according to history, we know, the Bible is actually historically, it's a very accurate book. You can go back and trace these things. So in the so-called books of history in the Bible, you can see the progression of kings. And at this time, the nation of Israel had been taken into captivity in Babylon. And at some point, the nation of Babylon, before this point, had been conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. So eventually, by the end of Daniel, he was no longer under Babylonian authority, but he was under Persian authority. And there were some notable kings among the Persians, but there was one named Cyrus who's got a really excellent prophecy about him. He's even mentioned by name before he even appeared. But anyway, he gave the command that the nation of Israel, the children of Israel, to return to the promised land and, start to rebuild the temple, rebuild Jerusalem. But they didn't get it done that fast. Eventually, there was another king, Darius, and he issued another decree to go back and complete the building of the wall around the city. So this is all very interesting. In the book of Jeremiah, Jeremiah was somewhat contemporary with Daniel. Daniel was a young man when they went into captivity in Babylon. Jeremiah remained in Jerusalem and watched the destruction. But through Jeremiah, the Lord revealed that there'd be 70 years that they would be in captivity. Now here it talks about 70 weeks. And if you apply 70 weeks to the timeline that we know historically, it obviously just does not fit. I mean, it took many, 70 weeks is about a year and a third, something like that. And this obviously took a lot longer than that. So, but it's an important prophecy. So Bible scholars have been analyzing it, for centuries. There are three events outlined here. One is the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem, and then the time of Messiah the Prince. Now, Messiah the Prince is the Lord Jesus. He's the Messiah. But there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Those are 2 periods of time. So there's an issuing of a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, and then that will be 7 weeks, and then there'll be 62 weeks after that. It says Messiah will be cut off. This will be the crucifixion of Christ. So people started analyzing that, and they couldn't get it quite to fit because they didn't realize the way they had to measure the time. Well, one thing, they realized a week is not a week, but a week is a period of 7 years. So now we're not talking about a year and a third. 70 weeks are 70 times 7, which is 490 years. So now we're talking about a time frame that we can work with. But it didn't measure out exactly to what they knew the historical record was until there was a very famous Bible scholar. He wrote a book called The Coming Prince. And in that, he really got into it, but he had the correct understanding. The Hebrew, the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar. So a month is 30 days, a year is 360 days, not 365. So when he applied that, then you find out, wow, this really fits. It fit the historical record. Now, we don't know the exact day Jesus was crucified. We know about. We know historically when the kings of Persia were. Anyway, it all really lined up. So this is pretty exciting. This was prophesied exactly what would happen. But then it says that at the end, the last verse, it says, he'll make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. Now, the he in this verse is not the Lord Jesus, it's not God. But this is one called the desolator. And we will get into this more. In other places, we refer to him as Antichrist. In the book of Daniel, if you go into chapters 11 and 12, he's got a complete prophetic history of the things that are going to be happening for the next couple hundred years, which king is going to rise up and which king is going to fall. But there was a fellow in history, who's Antiochus Epiphanes, and he's a type, a figure of the coming Antichrist. He came in, he desolated the temple, and then the Maccabees rose up against him. So you got the whole thing about Hanukkah actually comes from that historical event. But anyway, this one, the Antichrist, the beast, he says he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. In other words, for 7 years. And in the middle of the week, he will cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and will replace the sacrifice and the oblation with abominations of the desolator. So in the middle of the week, so in after 3.5 years, he will break the covenant. Now the sacrifice and the oblation, these are the Jewish worship, the way they offer things in the temple. He'll cause that to cease. So maybe before that, he actually allowed things to happen. He'll cause that to cease. And then there's 3.5 more years, and then the end. The end is the Lord's second coming. So this is really important because we realize, okay, the first 2 parts of this prophecy are done. Jerusalem was rebuilt. It was destroyed later, but historically it was rebuilt. Then Jesus came as the Messiah. He was crucified. That all happened. But then there's still 1 week left, 1 7-year period that's still to come. So this is a prophecy that has not yet been fulfilled. But now consider our current state. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, 3.5 years. There's several passages in the Bible that talk about 3.5 years, because the last half of the 1 week is 3.5 years. In Revelation 12:14, this is talking about the woman You can read all the chapters to get the context. But she's taken away into the wilderness, and so she's nourished for a time and times and half a time. What does that all mean? Well, if you say a time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and half a time is half a year. That's 3.5 years. In Revelation 11:2, it talks about the court which is outside the temple is cast out. It's been given to the Gentiles. They will trample the holy city for 42 months. 42 months is 3.5 years. In 11:3, the very next verse is talking about its two witnesses. We'll get into all of these things later in more detail, but it'll cause them to prophesy 1,260 days. If we go with a 360-day calendar, 1,260 days is 3.5 years. Then Revelation 13:4 and 5 talks about the beast. The beast is the Antichrist, is given to him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. Authority was given to him to act for 42 months. And you go back to Daniel. This isn't the only place in Daniel that it's mentioned. In 12:7, this is actually talking about the end, these last 3.5 years. But again, here you have a time and times and half a time. So this 3.5 years appears several places in the Bible. And it's always in relation to this 3.5 year period, which starts at the breaking of the covenant that the Antichrist makes with the nation of Israel before that time. Now, there's some things in here which are interesting, because it says in Daniel that he'll cause the sacrifice to cease. In Revelation, it says the temple will be, the holy city will be trampled. It talks about the temple, or makes reference to the temple a lot. Eventually, the beast will set up his image. I don't know what it's going to look like. It's going to be, maybe it's some high-tech thing that, we can't even really, or they couldn't, comprehend or imagine. But he'll have his image, and actually it says it will do miraculous things, but he'll set it up in the temple. Now, if you know the history of Israel, God chose Abraham, promised him the good land. Eventually they went to Egypt, his descendants, captive for 400 years, came back, took the good land, and they built the temple. Before that, they had the tabernacle, which is kind of a portable temple, like a tent. They built the temple for the reason, God needed his dwelling place. That was his house. So that was the center of everything. It wasn't just the center for the Jews. Actually, you could say that was the center of the whole earth. Because for the whole earth, God wants a people, and he wants a house built up. Now, of course, that's Old Testament, and that typifies today the church is the house of God. The church is the expression of God. The church is the place where we worship. The church is, God's ruling and authority. But in the Old Testament, the temple was there, and the temple was built at a very specific site. It wasn't just built, they didn't search around and find a nice place. This was built at a very specific place. It's on Mount Zion. Mount Zion, we think Mount is like really high. Actually, this is just an elevated plain. Zion's kind of the highest point. But they built the temple there. Then when Babylon came in and took them into captivity, the temple was destroyed. But then they went back and rebuilt the temple. And it stood until AD 70 when the Romans came in and destroyed it. And at that point, the nation of Israel was dispersed. So for AD 70 is, just short of 2,000 years ago. So what happened to Israel in all that time? They went in different nations, but they were always, many of them were very faithful. Even though they're kind of under a curse, yet still some were faithful. And eventually, in, I think it was 1949, the nation of Israel was restored. And this in and of itself is a very remarkable thing, because if you look at history, the history in the world, if I read this, if a nation like ceases to exist, if it's, completely desolated, destroyed, the people are scattered, you've got a certain time frame that that nation can be reestablished. Once you go past 200 years, it just never happens. Well, this was close to, it was at least 1900 years later, Israel became a nation again. God had a very firm covenant with Israel, and he does not break his covenants. They're still his people. They're under the Old Testament dispensation, which is not the same as the New Testament dispensation. But he still has a covenant with them. They're still his people, and they still have a definite place in his plan. So he gathered them together. Let's have the next slide. Now, Matthew chapter 24, like we've mentioned, this is really a very good chapter to get into study because it talks a lot about the signs of the Lord's coming. And in 24 verses 32 and 33, it says, "Learn the parable from the fig tree. As soon as its branch has become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So also you, when you see all these things, know that it is near at the doors." So he's using the sign of a fig tree beginning to bud and, put forth its leaves. In the springtime, you know the summer is near. So when you see that, then you know the end is near. His return is near. So we got to figure out, what is the fig tree? Well, the Bible is very clear. In the Old Testament, the fig tree is a type or a picture of the nation of Israel. And so I've got another verse on here, Matthew chapter 21. You all know this story. Jesus going with his disciples, going back to Jerusalem. He's hungry. There's a fig tree, comes to it and finds nothing on it except leaves. So there's no fruit. And this was really a kind of a picture of the nation of Israel at that time. They're still God's people, but they weren't producing anything to satisfy him. So there's a curse. It says, "May there no longer be fruit from you forever," and the fig tree was instantly dried up. So from the time of that curse, really, that was almost the end of the nation of Israel. Now, through the centuries, people have studied the Bible. And you can find older books, and I can show you some, where they talk about this prophecy, and they all agree this means the nation of Israel will be restored. Now, these were, giving in the 1700s, 1800s. It was just impossible. How could the nation of Israel ever be restored? Well, it took a lot of series of events. It took the Holocaust, which was a terrible thing. But eventually, the nation of Israel in 1949 came back into existence. And I don't know if I know any anymore, but I know some older Christians. That was before my time. I'm not that old. But they were alive at that time. And they were, they knew the Bible, and they knew that someday Israel would be restored. And so when that happened, this is a prophecy that they were looking for. So in their lifetime, they saw it happen. This is an amazing thing. Then you skip ahead about 20 years, not only did Israel become a nation, but Jerusalem was retaken. Now, if you know history, when Israel was reestablished, the city of Jerusalem was divided. And the only really important part of Jerusalem was on the east side, because that's where the temple should be built. In the meantime, a few hundred years ago, the Muslims built, I think it's their third most holy site there, the Dome of the Rock, the Mosque of Omar. And that's on exactly the place where the temple was. Now they say, there was never any temple there. Archaeologically, you can find a lot of proof. You dig down a little bit. But, they are not going to give that up. But not only was Israel established, the city of Jerusalem, the entirety of that city was taken by the Jews. Of course, that's in dispute. A lot of people don't recognize it. But even these days, you look, some very interesting things are happening. Now, whether you like Donald Trump or not, that's up to you. But he did one thing. He recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel as far as diplomatic relations. And a few other countries have done it, followed suit. Of course, that makes, the non-Christian people, nations around there, furious because they don't want, the Jews to have that land and that site. Because this is, like I said, this is the most important piece of real estate in the whole world. This is what everyone is fighting over. It's like how you line up with Israel really matters. So you see people are for Israel or they are against Israel. Now, Israel has had a strong supporter in the United States. But someday, maybe that will change. And Israel might, it's hard for them to exist by themselves. I mean, it's not nothing against them, but they're a small country surrounded by enemies on all sides. They should have been wiped out many times, but you can see the miraculous intervention of God to maintain that nation because it has to be there. It has to be there so the Lord can return. But maybe if the U.S. will stop supporting Israel, they'll have to turn somewhere else. And we will get into this regarding Antichrist. But they may need to turn to someone who's a powerful ruler in the world for support. And he'll sign a treaty with them, a covenant with them, a promise with them. But then halfway through, he will break it. So let's go to the last slide. So the last slide is the rebuilding of the temple. This goes along with the whole idea of the nation of Israel. You need the nation of Israel because you have to have the site for the temple. Because you have to have this temple, because if you don't have the temple, you can't have sacrifices. You can't have Antichrist setting up his image in the temple. And I think most Christians that you talk to, even if they've got kind of a cursory knowledge of prophetic events, they would say, well, the only thing remaining is for the temple to be rebuilt. And it will be rebuilt. It has to be rebuilt. Will it be rebuilt before those last 7 years or during those last 7 years? I don't know. The Bible doesn't say. But we do know it will be rebuilt. What do you do with the mosque that's there already? Israel does a lot of things that infuriate, the Arab nations. And it's not Arab nations, it's Islam is just fighting against, Israel all the time. So, but, if they would touch that, not even the U.S. could help them. But if they get a strong enough advocate that everyone is afraid of because he's so powerful, maybe he leads a powerful nation, I don't know, then they can do something bold enough. Maybe they would tear down the mosque, or maybe if there's wars going on, an errant missile will come and destroy that mosque. But before they can rebuild it, the Jews are ready. They are ready with the temple. They've got all the pieces together. They just would need a day or two to clear the debris, and they'd have the temple up. Once the temple is up, that really, as far as outward signs, that's about it. So we can see from these prophecies, there's 1 week left to go, 1 7-year period. There will be a covenant signed by this powerful ruler. Halfway through, he'll break it. The last half, the last 3.5 years, is what the Bible refers to as the Great Tribulation. We will get into that in detail also. But maybe that's enough for tonight. I hope that's clear. And if it's not, you have time in your breakout groups to ask questions. So thanks for coming tonight. Come next week. Next week's going to even be more interesting.